So the skills gap, I mean, it continues to be a significant problem, I guess, both for technology companies themselves, but also all those companies, and I guess it's the vast majority that use, rely on technology for some of their key activities. What's going on, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a great observation. It's kind of ironic. I mean, those of us who've been in tech for, let's say north of 20 years, we got into this because there was a skills gap around technology. And here we are, in some cases, 20, 25 years later, and there's still, levels of skills gaps. Now, I would say it's probably a function of three things. I think number one, the technology that we see out in the market today just evolves and it changes at just an ever increasing and accelerated pace. And I just think at some level, you just can't hire enough folks to actually fill the skills gap that you need. So ultimately, it just requires that you need to train, you need to fill those gaps in some way, shape, or form. I think the other thing I would just call out as a part of it is that, the traditional kind of education, institutions and systems are historically not very well equipped to kind of fill those demands, fill those gaps. And so many of the companies and organizations that we work with every day, part of their curriculum is actually onboarding new engineers, onboarding new graduates, because they just don't have the practical working knowledge to come and workforce and be as productive or be billable right from day one. And I think the third thing you typically find is that, often the most knowledgeable people, the people that really know the technology that could perhaps be the best at teaching it, also happen to be billable on actual full-time projects. They're doing the actual customer-facing work. So you can't really pull them off those things. And I think those three kind of things, just the pace of technology change, the rate at which traditional education can kind of meet demand, and the third being that it's just, that those constraints force your most knowledgeable people to be even more constrained, I think is why we continue to see it, being a challenge across, most of the sectors and industries that we serve.
Okay, and I'm just wondering as well, because you carried out or published a recent report. So I'm just wondering how the Skillsoft, I think is with it, Lean Into Learning report, how does it sort of confirm the importance of upskilling? And also I'm thinking alongside that, there is a sort of increased activity in upskilling as well.
Sure, no, it's a great question. So I think number one, I would just say that, the Lean Into Learning report is probably one of the most comprehensive studies that's conducted in the industry. I mean, we serve well over 3,500, leading organizations around the world, somewhere in the order of 70% of the Fortune 1000. And the usage constitutes literally millions and millions of learners from all over the, all over the market. And not only are we measuring, the uptick and the adoption of technology skills, but we also are measuring kind of adjacent skills, like things like agile, like leadership, like communication, virtual teams, and even safety topics. And I think what we see across, all the different industries and segments that we serve is there's certainly an uptick in terms of consumption, in terms of, completions, in terms of the digital badges, issued. Just as one data point, we issue more than 1 million digital credentials and digital badges each month across all the different, technologies and even leader topics that we serve. And that continues to rise. And that just shows you, the level of completion and the level of effort that people are putting in to continue to get their skills, up to date and reshaped, that have that validated, to have that credential, to actually have a badge that you can use that survives even your current tenure with the current employer is very, very marketable. And we definitely see that as kind of an uptick and something we see as an indicator of increased consumption.
And I'm wondering, are there particular sort of technologies where there's a high demand for skills at the current time? And if there is or are, is that sort of universal? Is that a global demand, or do we see any sort of regional nuances, variations as to what skills are hot right now, if you like?
Yeah, it's a great. I mean, we generally see kind of four technology segments generally, where we see kind of concentration and consumption. So cybersecurity, not surprisingly, that continues to be a very hot topic across multiple industries. Cloud, because just the very nature of cloud, the technologies that are used, they update so frequently that, the engineers, the administrators that are actually working with those technologies always have to be recertified and understand what's going on. And then certainly data. I mean, the businesses today, produce data at such a volume, in such a manner, in such a structure that traditional kind of data cataloging and analytic tools, just don't necessarily keep pace. And so there's just this constant need for people to really know things like Python, to know R, how to work with non-structured data, how to create data lakes and different kind of data technologies and reporting, so they can do predictive analysis. That's a huge segment of what we do. And then certainly coding, the web development, full stack application development, that continues to be a very, very, very popular topic. But I will say, and I know we'll probably cover it in a little bit more detail later on, we certainly see heightened interest year on year in topics like agile and virtual teams, in like the basic kind of communication and power skills, like written communication, how to effective listening, emotional intelligence. And we're actually seeing that increase trend in technology companies, and companies that you would think would be almost exclusively focused on upskilling and learning about coding and cyber and cloud, really are starting to make leadership and power skills and human skills an even bigger priority.
Just to follow up on the coding angle, I mean, low code, no code is a big sort of trend, but despite that, we're still seeing a high demand for, I mean, you can't avoid coding obviously at some stage, but you potentially need less skilled people, than you might have. But is it just because of the explosion of applications, etc., that there's still a high demand for coding?
Yeah. Well, I think at the end of the day, as I said before, there's so much data that's available to the modern business, to the modern enterprise, and organizations and the applications that they deliver and they host, and whether it's e-commerce, whether it's software as a service, whether it's hosted applications, subscription services, all these things produce just massive amounts of data, right? And they require massive amounts of enhancements, feature development. And so, this need for coding certainly hasn't gone anywhere. Well, certainly the tools have been much improved. And certainly, there's increasing access for non-coders, people that are just traditional business professionals, to build low-code apps, right? To actually use off-the-shelf tools to create kind of low-code, interactions and applications and things that can certainly create value for their enterprise. It still hasn't necessarily supplanted the need for really highly skilled developers to build rich applications that can do very interesting things and handle all of that and create immersive experiences. And I think that's why you see the continued interest in coding languages like Java, Python, certainly all the JavaScript frameworks. We continue to see very strong demand, and that's because the applications that are getting developed and designed by all these organizations are just getting more robust, and so we would expect that to certainly continue into the future.
And the pace of change, I mean, it seems to increase year on year. So I mean, you highlighted the areas where the current sort of focus is when it comes to upskilling, but in 12 months time, I know none of us can bear in mind what's happened in the last 12 or a couple of years, whatever. Predicting anything is perhaps foolish, but have you any idea of what might be in 12 months time, what other sort of job roles or skills might be sort of high up on the priority list?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I will say that based on the signals that we see in the market, the need for improved leadership, the need to more effectively manage agile teams, to effectively manage conflict, to communicate better, empathy, emotional intelligence. Even in technology organizations, we're seeing that to be a much stronger signal. We work with some customers that literally have hundreds of thousands of developers, right, and engineers, and they're telling us that their number one challenge and focus for the coming year is really around building better works. And we think that speaks volumes, right? We really see that it's the intersection of the technology skills, the ability to actually produce the applications, to manage your network, to deploy applications in the cloud, paired with the human skills, the power skills, the cognitive skills, to actually help teams work better, to innovate, to think about us more creatively. it's the intersection of those two things that really create value. So, my prediction in the next 12 months is that certainly we'll see increased demand for the things I mentioned, cyber, data, cloud, coding. I think you're going to see a pretty significant uptick in leadership skills. And when you think about that, one real basic example, and we're living really kind of a unique time, right? We actually, when you think about it, there is an entire generation of leaders who have come into the workforce since 2020, over the last 3.5 years, who probably have not had any formal leadership training or management training, right? We actually work in an environment now that continues to be, heavily virtualized. It's hybrid in some cases. You've got some people in the office, you have some people available and online virtually. And now you have new leaders that are coming into these roles, right? And they may have been put in these leadership roles because they're the best technologists, right? And now they have to lead teams in a world where, the baby boomers have left the work environment at an accelerated rate. And so we see just a massive need for just first-time manager training, just, the basic leadership skills. And I think you're going to continue to see that here in the next, 12 to 24 months.
And I'm wondering, is there a sort of magic formula for companies to make the balance between what you've been describing, maybe the soft skills, although that perhaps undersells them because they are very important. Soft skills suggest they're not very important, but they are clearly important. And technology training, I mean, is there a recommended template, or does it just really depend on each individual organization?
Yeah, it's a fair question. And, I would say that we typically advise organizations to think about the personas of their workforce. Historically, the way that we've thought of, we have a system of learning journeys that we've created that we call Skillsoft Aspire, right? And that's a system of learning paths. And what we typically try to do with the learning journeys is that they actually progress in roles. So we have a data science journey. It starts out with data analyst, goes to data wrangler, data ops, and then ultimately up to data scientist. Along each part of those journeys, we're actually curating and blending in some leadership training, some communication skills, so that in what's actually very much a technology journey, let's call it, and these are imprecise numbers, right? But let's call it, 10% of the overall instructive time, or maybe 20%, is actually something communication and teamwork, and how to actually work better as an organization, right? There's no necessarily perfect blend. I would say, I think it does depend on the organization that you're with. But typically what we'd like to see is that when organizations think about their skill profiles, and they think about their skill priorities, as they're planning that trajectory, that they're carving out some time for the human skills, for the leadership skills. I say that out of one side of my mouth. Out of the other side of my mouth, I will say that the squad leaders, the folks that are the scrum masters, the folks that are actually leading people every day, I would say it's probably the reverse. They probably need 90% or 80% of their time has to be on leadership and power skills and cognitive skills, and maybe only 10 to 20% on the technology skills. They really need to rely upon the folks that are in their organizations, the senior architects, the senior developers, to really have command of the technology so they can focus on the leadership tasks. But that's just kind of some of our initial thinking on it.
I'm just wondering if the Skillsoft report had anything to say on, and we've been talking obviously about upskilling, internal, if you like, training, but there is another alternative, which is you can go out into the market and acquire the skills that you want. So again, are there any sort of, did it uncover what people's views are, and also from your own experience, what are the pros and cons, I guess, of each approach, or is it a mix and match approach?
Yeah, and I'm probably not going to get the exact metric right, but the cost of actually recruiting a new person to come in and actually join the workforce, to actually, between the onboarding, the recruitment costs, them actually transitioning from their current employer, the lost productivity time, it's something, it's like a 2x or 3x difference versus just actually redeveloping the person that you have. The exact figure actually stated in the report. We can certainly make that available to the viewers in the video. But I will say, I think when you sit down and you do the math, you simply can't hire enough people at scale and get them onboarded quickly enough so that they can be productive, at a rate that you need them. And so what we typically find that organizations do is they look for adjacencies, right? If they know that they have folks that are sitting in the cyber practice, right? And they may find that the cyber practice, for whatever reason, may be between projects, or it may be forecasted to be light. They may take those folks and actually redeploy them over to the networking practice, right? Because it's an adjacency. You can actually bring them into networking and maybe even cloud, types of activities and administrative types of things, and actually have them redeployed so that they're productive in other areas. But I think in most cases, what we almost universally find is that when you sit down and you do the math of it, you can actually take someone from an adjacency and, over a matter of, let's say a month or two, you can get them redeployed and rebillable, into another practice that's maybe somewhat similar to what they've done. And you can actually kind of preserve the productivity of the organization and maintain utilization. Versus if you had to go and recruit those folks from scratch, you're certainly not going to be able to add 100, 200 developers inside of, 60 days, right? Because you have just the lead time of getting the application posted. You have to screen the candidates. You have to validate that the candidates are actually suitable for the position. Then, oh, by the way, once you actually bring the candidates on board, you still have to train them to get into the role. So you're looking at, like, in some cases, 6 months or more before, you basically have a posting to the point that they're actually productive. And so those are just some of the real basic anecdotes when you just look at the cost of actually recruiting new talent versus, reskilling people internally.
And I'm wondering if the report had anything to say, or again, anecdotally, in terms of the actual disruption being caused by the, I know everyone says there's a lack of skills, but it's a sort of almost like an existential debate. But is there some real hard evidence that companies are being held back, in terms of their technology-led growth? I won't say they're going out of business, but they're just not growing at a pace which they could easily cope with it if they had the right, right skills and the right people.
Right. And there's a whole host of research that's out there, and you will find that, some estimates that there will be billions, if not trillions, of lost productivity over the next 10 to 15 years by just simply not having the skills available. And as I said, there's research institutions that range in everyone from the World Economic Forum to a whole host of others that have actually measured the cost of the skills gap in some way, shape, or form. Now, those are very broad estimates, right? And they range across multiple industries and multiple geographies. So there's not massive amounts of precision in some of the data, but the numbers are big, no matter how you kind of look at them, right? You can get to more precision when you actually speak to individual customers and they start sharing some of the realities and the anecdotes that they deal with every day. That in many cases, when we sit down with a customer, they will have a project that simply has to get done, by the end of the year, by mid-year, right? That they're actually indexing their entire business around. If you want to digitize your entire customer experience, and the goal is to basically be able to do, let's say, 75% of your business through e-commerce. Well, if you think back through all the flows that actually have to occur there, right? You actually have to start that project, very early on, right? And the cost of actually not doing that, let's say that someone is not able to retool their entire environment so they can take 75% of their business through e-commerce, right? Now all of a sudden they may not be able to scale their business. They probably had scalability assumptions built into their overall financial model that was actually based on automating transactions, right? And if you have to have more humans involved, or maybe a traditional kind of business flow, it compromises the entire kind of business model that someone has around that. So we hear those types of anecdotes all the time where, there's certain strategic initiatives that organizations have around just digitizing the business, trying to be able to move more customer experience into the cloud to make the business more virtual. And that really translates into how they plan to scale the business, right, to actually achieve growth. And if they're not able to do that because they don't have the technology, well, then it compromises the entire kind of business plan. And those tend to be the anecdotes that are far more compelling.
And I'm just wondering, I mean, this is perhaps an unfair, a large question, so I'll try and get it all organized. Your sort of final thoughts on how bad the situation is now, and for starters, how and over what time is it possible to address it? And in terms of addressing it, I mean, there's obviously the upskilling that you mentioned, but I'm wondering, I mean, in the UK, for example, our new Prime Minister when maths, everyone has to do maths up to sort of, they leave the school system. So schooling it out, I mean, it's complicated, I know, but have you any thoughts as to, short and longer term, how, organizations, etc., can address what is clearly a problem?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think the way I would probably answer it is, number one, I will say that we have made dramatic progress over the past 5 to 10 years in improving our ability to reskill learners digitally, right? Meaning to be able to do things online, to actually build kind of functional software projects, to, go into a cloud instance and actually, being able to administer things and test your knowledge and really be able to do those things at scale without having to send them to, a physical classroom, right? Or actually put them in a sync environment. Now we do all those things too. And for high criticality tasks, it's still very important, but even those tools have gotten far more extensible and far more scalable. And you even think through the pandemic, there's so many more folks are actually going and getting virtual training right now than we saw in 2018, 2019. And that's just because the tools have gotten better, the environments have gotten more rich, and our ability to measure the outcomes has gotten better. Having said all that, where we sit today is that at the same point in time where while education technology has certainly gotten more robust and gotten more efficient, businesses have been completely transformed since 2019. If you think about the last 3.5 years, virtually every business has had to reinvent, how they actually, interact with their customers, how they actually do very simple things like process and order, collect cash, how it actually contributes to their EBITDA, to their bottom line. And so the target is not getting any easier. It's just getting more complex. And then we live in a world that's kind of also bereft with risk in many ways, right? You actually have more cybersecurity challenges today with more businesses, doing business online and virtualizing experiences than you ever did before. So it creates more vulnerabilities that have to be looked after. So while the education has certainly improved, right? The overall environment that we sit in has just continued to actually transform at an accelerating rate. And it's gotten in some cases a lot more unpredictable. We actually, as you mentioned, we live in a very unpredictable kind of economic time. So that just adds another level of uncertainty. As we think towards the future and what does that really mean? Will we be sitting here 10, 20 years from now still kind of bemoaning and thinking about the skills gap? I think at some level, we'll certainly get better at imparting and delivering and getting people reskilled at scale. I truly believe that. And I think that we're just on the front end of that experience. I think you're going to see social and cohort experiences come together with e-learning in a much more robust way. We have an entire experience that we call a career journey, which brings instructor-led and coaching and mentoring in line with self-study, e-learning modules. And we think that those things are going to become more the norm. We certainly see applications of new technology, interactive practice labs, AR, VR, those things will certainly become more mainstream. But at the same point in time, we're going to see technology continue to change at an ever evolving rate. However, what will be different in the next 20 years is the emergence of AI. You have tools like ChatGPT. You've got new AI algorithms that will get smarter, that will be able to supplement what traditionally humans needed to do. And you're going to see that technology and knowledge gets to be more at scale and be more productive. So I do think that the skills challenge is going to evolve. I don't think it'll be the same, we need just the true technology skills, just those constant technology skills. I certainly think that those will become higher order and people need to be trained on it. I actually see the next 10 years being a function of how do we get people to work better together. It's going to be a function of leadership. It's going to be a function of how do the next generation of leaders lead in a very different environment that, in my mind, is always going to be increasingly virtualized. It's going to be hybrid. You're going to have teams, some that may be in the office, some that may be online. They'll certainly all be around different time zones. And I think for technologists, that's going to put a very unique set of requirements and constraints and needs on the business, where they're just going to have to continue to invest in better leadership, emotional intelligence. And I think you're going to see that return to those basic kind of human skills, power skills, leadership, empathy in the future. I think that's really where the market's going to trend.
Okay. I mean, it's been great to chat to you, and you've given us a lot of food for thought and some great insights. And Mark, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the time today, Philip. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks again.